begun recording the second.
Okay, I've also begun recording the second.
Cool.
Alright. 3,
3,
2,
2,
1.
1.
Hey, nerd.
Hey, nerd. That was closer. That was
a little bit
closer.
I think.
We're
just
doing...
maybe incapable of talking at the same time on Skype.
Yeah.
I think.
I think we're both... The problem is that we're both waiting for the other person to begin the thing, which means that, like, the amount of time between each thing gets longer. So I feel like we're just playing a game of chicken with our intro, which is really fun.
Yeah, well, hopefully, if I've done my job correctly, which I think I will have by the time this episode goes up, we'll have put intro music at the beginning of this episode, like real professionals.
Ooh, yes.
Maybe not an intro, but intro music is going to be present. So yeah, we're going to be adding one component of a professional podcast each week. So tune in for that to see what we come up with next time. Maybe it's outro music. You know?
Yes.
I think by episode 5 we should have a Blue Apron sponsorship.
Yes. Or the other food one that all of the commentary YouTubers... HelloFresh.
Ah.
That all the commentary YouTubers get sponsorships from.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So, I guess we have an intro also in current events that happened this week that made me personally very upset and called me out. So I saw this quiz on BuzzFeed that was like, how much lesbian energy do you radiate? And for any listeners who are not Shelby or just don't know me in real life, I am lesbian. And I was
can't
like,
see the fact that Caroline's wearing a flannel right now, like a real lesbian.
With the Tree of Gondor on it, for reasons that will become clear. Anyway, I took this lesbian quiz, because I was like, this should be easy. This is a quiz that I've, like, spent, more or less the past 5 years, studying
You've studied and prepared for it, yes.
Yeah, I've studied and prepared for it. Got 40%, which is not great, and then I told Eli this, and Eli, in an act of absolute betrayal, proceeded to get a 100%, despite meeting approximately 0? Of the qualifications for being a lesbian.
Being attracted to men in addition to women, because I am pansexual, and then also not being a woman.
Yeah.
So I did a really peak move where I went back and I put my answers again so that I could, like, so in, like, this act of, why did I do this and then you not get this? I don't know. I feel like the things I put aren't necessarily very lesbian in energy. But I guess the BuzzFeed has just decided that I have lesbian energy, which I think is very funny.
Yeah, and another twist in the knife was when I told my brother this, and my brother is a straight male, and he took the quiz, and he also got 100%, which is, like, absolutely insane.
Yeah, so, at least I'm also queer, so there is some sort of, like, maybe there's a line that follows here, but with your brother, it's like...
There is literally nothing. He's, like... My brother fits literally every criteria for, like, how people should be treated by virtue of just how much privilege he's accrued. And he just got 100%. The straight boy got 100% when I got 40. And I'm mad about it. I did retake it and I got an 80%, so I improved somewhat.
Yes, but also, whenever you retake a quiz, I question a little bit, like, is this the genuine answer, or is this you striving to not get a 40%?
Yeah. Well, I think it was a little bit of both. There was a lot of stuff that I just wasn't, like, I don't know a whole bunch about. It was like, pick a drag queen, and I was like, it's not a scene that I know much about, unfortunately. So I just, like, picked a different one at random. But yeah.
Nice.
So anyway, that happened. We have what we call a Brendan question for this week as well, and the question for this week, that I believe it's my turn to ask, is... If you personally were a Dungeons & Dragons class, like not a player, like not to play, if you were in real life a Dungeons & Dragons class, which class would you be?
So I have 2 answers for this question, because and I think it's still up, but it was going around for a while, and it was like a quiz you took where you answer like 100-something personal questions, and then it tells you your class and race and alignment, I think.
Oh, wow.
So I took that quiz, and I got level 3 multi-class, 2 levels of monk, 1 level of wizard, which I think makes sense a little bit, because it's like, I have that recklessness of just throwing myself at situations of a monk, but I'm also a nerd. as evidenced by this podcast and my existence.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, like, maybe the more honest answer, but when I look deep inside myself, I think that I would really like to be, I don't know, maybe, like, what I am is probably a sorcerer or something, like, a little bit more chaotic than a wizard, but definitely still, like, a weak boy spellcaster class, because I think that that's probably, except, I don't know, I feel like you can throw a lot of situations at me, and I survive them by pure luck, so maybe a little bit more of, like, a buffer class, but deep in my heart, I'm just weak boy spellcaster, and I think that sorcerer probably fits that the best.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, physical prowess and studiousness say wizard, but sarcasm says bard. So that's
be a
kind of
multi-class. Be a multi-class.
Yeah, so
wizard
that's what
bard.
I'm thinking, you know? Maybe take a level in vicious, just to get vicious mockery, and then, you know, just kind of end it. I'm also not, I play piano, but I'm not very good at it, and that's not a great bard instrument, because you do have to lug it around quite a bit.
What are they called? You could get those pianos that are like, they're the hand pianos that you blow air into and then you play music, and I've seen them, like, represented twice in media, once in, I think, Eli and April, and then another time in someone who just strolled around San Diego Comic-Con playing themes on that.
I think fucking ridiculous is what that is called.
Well, yes, but I don't know if that's the official name. I don't know if you look that up on Google, you would find any images of the instrument itself.
Okay. Well, now that that's out of the way, I guess we should actually introduce what this episode's about, to our... Now we have at least one returning listener, maybe two. Mariah has indicated that she listened to at least part of the first episode, now that it's up. So, I'm gonna assume that we're talking to an audience of two, neither of whom I believe know anything about this topic, so we're gonna have a fun time explaining.
Yes, I just want to say the melodica, that's what they're called, melodicas.
Okay, how did you figure that out? How did you Google that?
I looked up air-based piano, and I didn't find any images of it, but in shopping someone had put up, like, melodica, and Google, I've typed enough bullshit into Google for it to be like, oh, do you mean this? When I give it none of that information.
Nice. Okay, so we have at least two listeners. I guess on the off chance that someone is listening to this and doesn't know who we are, in which case we've just spent like almost 8 minutes talking, and you're probably very confused. I'm Caroline, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
I am Eli, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And today we're going to be talking about Lord of the Rings, as you have probably figured out by the episode title and the description. So yeah.
Although I do realize that as I was reading it back through, we never specifically mentioned Lord of the Rings. We just made a bunch of, like, related references, and if you know absolutely nothing, you may not have gotten that.
Well, we're talking about it, so we're clarifying now, 8 minutes in, this is what we're doing.
Yes.
So I guess I'm gonna speak a little bit about the context of Tolkien. My brother is probably far more equipped to discuss this than I am, because my brother is actually the one who is the more hardcore Lord of the Rings nerd in our family. He's actually writing his, I think, IB paper on Tolkien's, like, construction of the Elvish language, which I think some people talk to as, like, the first constructed language, or conlang, in popular media, which gave way to, like, a whole lot of other conlangs, like Klingon and other things.
Yeah. I don't remember if it was Elvish, but it was definitely... So I did a whole research thing for debate on Tolkien, so I also know some information about him.
Nice.
But it was... I don't remember if it was Elvish specifically, but it was... His work was kind of the beginning of constructing conlangs outside of the context of we're just making specific words for this piece. It was Tolkien was one of, if not the first, to be like, I'm constructing a whole usable language that just exists in the world. And it's not necessarily, like, purely just to be in the books. He was just a big linguistics nerd and decided to use that to make a bunch of fake languages.
Yeah, I believe he was a linguist by trade, I think, or he definitely had, like, an academic degree of some kind in linguistics.
Yeah, he studied Old English, because one of the thing for which he got famous before he got famous for Lord of the Rings was that he produced the first translation of Beowulf, because he studied Old English and he was like a...
Oh shit, really?
Yeah, he
That's
produced the
awesome.
first translation of Beowulf that treated Beowulf as like a story instead of as like just a Rosetta Stone for Old English. He produced a translation where it was like actually usable to trace the narrative, and he made an argument for Beowulf to be studied not just as like a guidebook to Old English, but as also like kind of one of the first novels or first epic poems that like tell this story of the character.
Mm. And this passion for both old stories and linguistics kind of manifested in Tolkien's magnum opus. I get that feels like the wrong word because that implies it's one work. It's magnum opus. Um,
Well, I would argue that it was one work because he
mm,
intended it to be 6 books in one book.
yeah,
But his publisher was like, "That's dumb and bad. Don't do
yeah.
it."
So his magnum opus, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, depending on how you count.
Hmm.
And I guess like the reason that I think both of us are so interested to it and so drawn to it is because the fan base of Lord of the Rings is made up of pedantic nerds. Because
Yes.
Tolkien himself was a pedantic nerd. The reason The Hobbit got written down is because it was an oral storytelling like thing for his kids as like a bedtime story. And then his kids kept correcting him on stuff he'd mentioned earlier offhand, like, no, his cloak's actually this color because you mentioned that last night. So Tolkien's kids were pedantic nerds, so he wrote The Hobbit and kind of kickstarted this whole wave of pedantic nerds
Hmm.
to set up this entire fandom. And he basically wrote Lord of the Rings. I think it's widely considered to be like the first, at least the grandfather of a lot of high fantasy as we know it today. What with elves and dwarves and magic and epic
Hmm.
quests and big adventures. It is a very long-winded and long fantasy epic. That's just like, yeah, it's a cool series. And I can't summarize it because I'm still in the weeds, man. I'm still chugging through Return of the King after like a several month break from the series.
Mm.
So I cannot get any big perspective on it. I just know random quotes and vaguely what's happened up till now. The geopolitics of Middle Earth are unclear.
Mm. I mean, I would say, like, I can give a movie summary. I have made many valiant attempts at reading it, but it's always I get to the end of book one, not like the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, but the end of book
Mm.
one, which is the first half of Fellowship of the Ring,
Mm-hmm.
because Tolkien lied. He did not write 3 books. He writes 6 books, and then he put 2 of them together for each of the 3 like
Mm-hmm.
famous novels. Um, but to summarize the movies in a very short summary, One Ring bad because Sauron bad. 4 hobbits start adventure to destroy One Ring, encounter 2 humans, an elf, a dwarf, and then a wizard who is not a human, as my dad has been very quick to correct me every time I bring this up.
And he's
But is
God,
instead
technically.
some other entity.
Yeah.
Um, go on many adventures almost to get killed by the whole myriad of Middle Earth, and eventually, spoiler alert, destroy the ring.
Mm-hmm. And they do this by hucking it into a volcano. Um,
Yeah. Into
yeah.
one specific volcano, the only volcano that can destroy it.
Yeah.
Because
Because that's where it was
presumably there
made.
are other volcanoes, but I guess this is the biggest and most dangerous of them.
Yeah, I mean, from the maps that are in, like, the front of the book, it looks like it's the only kind of volcanic thing on the
Hmm.
continent, at least. There might have other things other places. And if you're like, wow, that sounds like a really intense story, and kind of hitting on the, like, Gandalf's not a human thing, oh, no. Having 6 books hiding as 3 books is not enough for Tolkien. No. He was like, I want to make a mythology for England that's like not centered on Christianity like King Arthur's stories are. I want to have a mythology for us that we can trace back several thousand years. So this man wrote literal millennia of
Hmm.
history for this
Hmm.
series, which is all mostly compiled in the Silmarillion, I believe, which is like
Yes.
the prequel to The Hobbit, which like by several thousand years, and it
Yep.
explains pretty much everything. In a letter from Tolkien to his publisher, which is like at the beginning of the edition of the Silmarillion that we have, Tolkien's like laying out the idea for this story, and he goes, "I'll keep this brief." And then I checked, and the letter goes on for 8 more pages. That is kind of
Hmm.
Tolkien's style. Um,
Um, I would say I have two things to say about that. One is that the Lord of the Rings takes place, I believe, at the transition from the Third Age to the Fourth Age, because it's like the end of the Age of the Elves, the beginning of the Age of Men, or maybe the beginning of the Age of Orcs, depending on where you are in the story and like who's dictating things. But Tolkien went back and he wrote a whole history of the First Age and the Second Age, which is like, why? No one, I guess 2 people needed that. And I bet in 100 years it's going to be super useful because people are going to make like their whole lives out of studying the Lord of the Rings. And then it'll be like, oh, look at this full history we have. It's super useful. Right now, we're close enough to it that we can still kind of make fun of him for being like pedantic nerd.
I mean, I think people already are studying it for sure. I definitely, like, my brother is a case study of this. He's using the Silmarillion as like a base text for a lot of what he's working with. My brother also read the Silmarillion at an impossibly young age, because that's the kind of person my brother is.
Very good.
It's wild.
Yes. And then I would say the other thing that's kind of like a token of the way that Tolkien writes is, one description I've often heard about him is Tolkien is a fantastic writer and probably one of the greatest authors of the English language, but he is also a man who can describe a pencil for 10 pages.
Yeah.
Because if you read any of his descriptions in the book, I think when they like first enter the forest, there's like 10 pages just about how tree trunks look and the way that the light falls. And it's very like, oh, I can fully envision the story, but I also just read 10 full pages of like natural diaspora.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough. It's a tough read. The reason it has taken me, I think, a few years at this point to even get to Return of the King, is because it is a long read, and I was honestly shocked to realize that, like, oh, this was all published in, like, 1954. This is not that old by most, like, old text standards, but it reads like I would have to get a dictionary to figure out exactly what natural, like, forest terms he's using to describe things, because he's, like, very set in, like, not Old English literally, but, like, older English in the way that he writes. Which is certainly beautiful and leads to some really great moments, but it is a lot to read. So we're gonna try and talk about the things that we like about Lord of the Rings without overwhelming you, without doing that, but also it's probably gonna end up being a very long episode as well.
Yes.
There's a lot to discuss.
There is a lot to discuss. I mean, even if we were just to talk about the movies, to spend the same amount of time as the shortest movie is, I believe, like 2 hours and 10 minutes. Which my dad did not believe, because I was like, yeah, all of these movies are ridiculously long. Or no, it's not 2 hours and 10 minutes. It's 3 hours and 30 minutes. It's 210 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, I was like, that's short for, I was like, are you talking about extended edition, or are you talking about, like, theater release?
Well, the theater release was, it was like 210 minutes is the shortest one, which is why if you look at, like, the actual DVD copies, I believe that they're all split into 2 films.
They are all split into 2 films, yes.
You cannot fit that much data on one CD. Well, you can, but they didn't want to fit that much data on one CD drive.
So you do have to, like, swap it out in the middle of the movie. You know, like we had to do back in ye olde days before streaming.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess, like, going off of the movies, like I said, my brother read the Silmarillion at an impossibly young age. He got into Lord of the Rings at a very young age. I think we watched through the trilogy when we were about 9. Which is appropriate, given that 9 has significance, because that's how many people are in the Fellowship. And I wasn't into
So how many ring wraiths there are?
Yeah. And that, too. That's the thing I remembered.
Again, very pedantic.
Yeah, we're very pedantic. And, you know, my brother definitely got into the, like, hardcore, like, very nerd, very pedantic all the time. And I was not super into it, especially because in a cruel twist of fate, I was very into Harry Potter as a kid. Because it's more marketed at kids who were our age at that time. So I was like, well, that's gonna be my thing. And then Lord of the Rings and Star Wars were, like, his things. And then I got older, and I don't know specifically what changed, but I was like, well, Lord of the Rings seems like it has a cool fan base, and I admire the aesthetics and the soundtrack, so I got more into it. And then I ran into you, and then we collectively, I think, got each other more into it somehow, despite being, like, pretty casual fans when we met by Lord of the Rings standards.
Yeah, so I first watched the movies. I mean, I'm sure that, like, I had been peripherally aware of them as a child, just because, like, I was in, elementary school when I read The Hobbit, and I just remember that because I read The Hobbit and Watership Down at around the same time, which are very dissimilar books, but they have, like, that similar kind of high English writing style. And I just remember both of them were books that I fully passed out reading, which is not something that happens anymore. But the first time I watched the movies, which is really where my knowledge of Lord of the Rings comes from, is in 7th or 8th grade. So not that long before we met was really when I was like, oh, the films. I think it must have been 8th grade, but my dad essentially sat down with me, and over the course of like a week, we watched these after school. So, which is intense. They're long films. But they're also like, it's good to watch them all together because, the films and the books don't quite line up. A lot of things are like moved from one film into a different book. So like the story very much has to be consumed all together, or else you're going to just miss things because there's like, it's not like with Harry Potter where there is like a summer between each, or most of a summer between each story. It's like, I think the first movie ends and then the next movie picks up 20 minutes later.
Yeah.
So they're all very like right next to each other.
Yeah, I don't think that there is a, like, in our family, I think when one of us sits down to watch Lord of the Rings, it's literally the 12-hour commitment that is watching all of the movies at once, because it's just, you just can't, like, or it's like a full weekend of just, like, doing that, but you can't really, like, parse it out, which is part of why I would have trouble summarizing, because I've been reading this on and off for, like, over the course of several years. I say several, probably, like, 2, which is technically more than 1, but, you know. And, like...
multiple.
Yeah, I just do not have the big picture anymore. I'm like, well, they're about to get to Mount Doom, and that's pretty much all I know. But yeah, I just kind of got more into Tolkien, I guess, probably around high school starting. So, like, a lot later than my brother did. I think because my brother had, like, kind of leaned back from it, and I was like, oh, I can like this now that you don't like it as much anymore. It's not your thing anymore. It can be mine. And yeah.
Only one of us can have it.
Yeah. And now both of us like it, which is fun. But yeah, it, like, was such a part of my childhood, like, it brings up a lot of nostalgia for me when I, like, hear the soundtrack, or, like, you know, they get to Rivendell for the first time. And yeah, I totally recommend watching at least one of the movies, if only to admire, like, how pretty everything is. Like, the outfits, and the sets, and, like, the props, and the people, as we will get to eventually.
I think if you really want to, like, if you want to watch a movie to get, like, the beauty, I would say definitely watch, either the first movie, because that's where you encounter, like, the elves, and the elves have very beautiful architecture, for Rivendell, and then, like, an insanely pretty forest thing.
Yeah, for Galadriel.
For, Galadriel. Or watch the third movie, because then you see a little bit more of, like, the beauty of the civilizations of men. Because I believe you don't see, like, the White City of Gondor until the third movie.
Yeah.
And you see a little bit of Rohan. Not as much, but Rohan is also not as beautiful architecturally.
Yeah, Rohan's kind of going through it.
Rohan is the horse people, and
Rohan's
that's their whole personality type.
Yeah, and they also got, Grima in charge for quite a chunk. So it's not doing great. But yeah, so it's, you know, this amazing story with, like, wizards and elves and dwarves and stuff. That's very, I think, hard to appreciate until you get older and you can make fun of it a little bit. I think that is one of the best parts of being into Lord of the Rings, is just how much ridiculous stuff there is, and just when you know a topic well enough to kind of lampoon it like that, I think that is the ultimate goal for, like, knowing a topic inside and out like that. It's very fun.
Yes, I think also, like, the thing about appreciating the aesthetics of Lord of the Rings, especially the aesthetics of elves, because I think one of the first times that we ever really were like, oh, we both like Lord of the Rings, is when we were making jokes about Thranduil, and specifically his design in the Hobbit movies, because, like, that's kind of the first time we've ever seen him on screen or on screen in, like, not human, live action, because I don't know how big of a deal he is in the various animated Hobbits. But from that was born the great quote, "I am the Moose King, king of all these Mises," which I have then adopted as, like, my life motto.
Yeah.
Because, you know, sometimes you make jokes about, fictional characters and then they're the best piece of comedy you've ever come up with, so.
Yeah. So, yeah, for those of you who don't know, Thranduil is Legolas' dad. We're gonna get to Legolas, trust me, because there's a lot to talk about with Legolas Greenleaf. But Thranduil is, like, king of the Sylvan Elves in the forest. And just, if you want to cheer yourself up after having a bad day, just look up behind-the-scenes footage from, The Hobbit on YouTube, specifically Thranduil's parts, because Lee Pace is, like, say what you will about the Hobbit movies, whether you like them or not, Lee Pace's Thranduil is one of the best casting choices I think anyone's ever made. He's just so dramatic, like, he's just this man voguing in these robes with, like, his, like, antler crown. It's a look, and it's fabulous. So yeah, I totally recommend that.
It's definitely a choice that they made, and they went strong on, and I appreciate it.
You know what, they went full throttle on that, yeah. Oh, the Hobbit movies.
The Hobbit movies, I think, like, you can make a defense for the first and second ones, because they stick pretty close to, like, these are actual events in the book, and they give them, like, a fair amount of time. My dad continues to complain about the fact that the third movie is just the Battle of Five Armies, which I believe is, like, 1.5 chapters in the book, and for which the main character spends most of, like, fully knocked unconscious, just on the ground.
Bilbo's asleep for that. He's not... Yeah. It's not that big a deal. Tolkien didn't care about war. He was... he had a lot of antipathy for war, and was also just generally like, this is not the most interesting part of the story, personally. So yeah, that was... interesting. And also the CGI was somehow worse. Well... I know how, because they didn't give the visual effects people enough time to do a good job with any of the visual effects. But they're worse than they were in, like, the original trilogy, which was, you know, made in the 2000s. And another, I think, point in the original trilogy's favor is that the people at Weta Workshop did not want the visual effects to look realistic. They wanted it to look like a storybook. So somehow the CGI from the early 2000s integrates, like, seamlessly into the actual movies. Like, I watched it, you know, I've watched the original trilogy a while back now, but I still remember being, like, completely awed by just how well everything melded together. It really did feel like they'd constructed Middle-earth and had just, like, filmed a documentary there or something. Yes,
I think one of the really great example of, like, CGI that's clearly not meant to be realistic, but because of that is, like, super cool, is the last March of the Ents, which is, like, it's an insane thing to be like, hey, I want you guys to CGI a bunch of walking, talking trees, fighting orcs. Have at it. And it's, like, the Ents don't look super realistic. I don't think the Ents could ever look realistic because they're inherently, like, unreal. But it's such, like, a cool scene, or a cool series of scenes to watch as the Ents go to war. Because it's obviously all CGI, but it's, like, so well done that you can almost, like, forgive yourself for forgetting that it's CGI in a way that I think a lot of movies don't allow you to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think the reason behind, like, just why the original trilogy is so beloved is because it was the first time Peter Jackson was really working with Tolkien's work, and, like we've said before, this is a fandom of pedantic nerds, which means that if you find someone who's into Lord of the Rings and ask them to work on a Lord of the Rings thing, they're gonna give 110%. So, like, Peter Jackson really threw himself into it. The people at Weta Workshop really threw themselves into it. The actors, everyone was, like, super committed and super invested in this project. And as a result, made this, like, really beautiful, faithful, just wonderful, movie trilogy. And then with The Hobbit, I'm so mad that we didn't get Guillermo del Toro's vision for The Hobbit. That makes me upset still. But studio politics and stuff led to not as great a job. Like, forgivable, but I'm still kind of sad about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the cool thing
I
about
think
Tolkien.
I was just gonna say, I think The Hobbit really shot itself in the foot when they were like, we're gonna make 3 different movies, which is like,
Mm-hmm.
again, studio politics and then the desire to make money out of
Mm-hmm.
this, like, which would obviously have been a big deal, and I can, even if I don't like it, I can appreciate the fact that money comes first to a lot of film studios because it's like they need to make things profitable.
Mm-hmm.
But The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, because it's a trilogy, and also because it's such like a massive just entity,
Mm-hmm.
can sustain 3 movies. The Hobbit really struggled, I think, to sustain 3 movies.
Yeah.
In a way that like kind of hurt even the really good parts of it, because there's a lot of stuff in there that I don't think was like a necessary addition. And I will come in and say, as much as I love Orlando Bloom, as much as I love Legolas, I don't think he needed to be in that
Mm-hmm.
movie. I don't think that it was necessary to do that.
Yeah. And I will say, in the Hobbit movie, they do kind of address the fact that there is a distinct lack of female characters in Tolkien's work, which we're also going to address in a minute. And they added in Toriel, who's this wood elf, and there's a love triangle between her, Legolas, and Keely, the dwarf? One of them.
Yeah, one of the pairs of dwarves with matching names, but...
Yeah. Because there are 13 of those, and apparently they all have somewhat distinct personalities. And that, the love triangle was something that made a lot of people upset, and it was something that made Evangeline Lilly, who played Toriel, upset, because that was one of her conditions, was like, I don't want to do any love stories, I just want her to be a cool character. And so it went that way in principal photography, and then reshoots happened, and the studio was like, but we need to make it marketable! We need there to be a love triangle! So yeah, I feel a little bit sad about that, of like, oh, that could have been such a cool character, and like, not have this, useless romance shoehorned in. But alas. So, at least we have, there's still some pretty good adaptations of The Hobbit. I think that, there's the animated version, which I've seen once, and that's from the 70s, and it's pretty good. It's pretty solid. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at with Lord of the Rings. And I guess what I kind of continue to love about it now that I think people don't focus on as much when they're talking about Tolkien, because a lot of the focus when you talk about Lord of the Rings is, oh, this world building and like this expansive history and like this amazing lore that is absolutely wonderful and should be lauded. I will quote Brian David Gilbert and say that he did do every single other fantasy writer a disservice by making them think that everyone has to do that. But the thing that I appreciate the most is not necessarily the world building. And we've talked about this, and I'm just going to bring it up again because I think it's a conversation worth repeating. That's not what I like about Lord of the Rings the most. What I like is, even though there is an absence of female characters, that means that there is the space for a kind of spectrum of masculinity that's not really available in most, like, mainstream products. Even in, like, high fantasy realms, there isn't, like, the same room for tenderness and vulnerability and, like, love and warmth that these male characters have in Lord of the Rings that I think is really special.
And I think another thing about, like, as much as I think that there is valid criticism for maybe not necessarily Tolkien excluding women, but the fact that, like, that has been taken by fantasy as a genre to be kind of underrepresentative of women. I think what is ultimately, like, the reason why I can excuse that for Tolkien is that, and I don't know how accurate this is, and I'm sure someone will eventually find this and be like, no. But a lot, like, from what I've heard and from what I've read, a lot of the way that he wrote the books, and I think a lot of, like, the themes and messages he puts in are very much based off of his own experience serving in World War I. And if it was World War II and that was wrong, again, I apologize. But, like, the thing about serving in World War I is that because he's writing a war story about this, like, a very World War I influenced war, is that women weren't really allowed to serve, or they weren't allowed to serve on the front lines. They were often not serving with men. And so I think, like, as he's drawing from those experiences, I can understand why it might have felt unnatural for him to, like, put a whole bunch of women in, just because that's not how war was allowed to be fought during World War I. And then I also agree that, like, the thing that makes, and I don't know if you said this and my brain just skipped over it, but it was like, as much as he's not including perhaps as many women as we now would like, or even we back then would have liked. He's including such like a broad range of what it means to be like a man, or what it means to be masculine, and like how that looks and how that can be influenced. Because you see like, and especially like the different ways that the same character can be masculine or can be like a man in this world. And I think one of the really beautiful examples of that, and they play it up more in the movies than in the books, is like the relationship between Aragorn and Boromir, which is like very contentious and very like two traditionally masculine people at like fighting with each other. But the last scene between them when Boromir is dying, like every time I watch that, it hits me right in the feels, because it's like these are two very masculine characters who are being allowed to like show emotion, show vulnerability, and show like a loyalty and love for each other that is deep down between them the whole time, but can only come out in this moment where one of them is dying, which is like a very beautiful way of showing like what it should actually mean to be a man and to be masculine, is like in these very tender, very prescient moments to be able to be like emotionally available and openly distraught at what's happening.
Yeah. And I'm gonna also say that on the note of Aragorn and Boromir, who are, I agree, very, like, masculine and kind of traditionally, like, they're very, you know, like, Aragorn is a ranger who's, like, you know, basically seen everything. He's very, like, rugged and haggard. And then there's Boromir, who's basically, like, kind of devoted his life to military service and trying to eventually ascend to stewardship and lead his country. Both of them, like, their soft side is revealed so much when they interact with the hobbits.
Yes.
Because the thing you gotta understand about hobbits is, I mean, number one, they come of age at 33, which is amazing, because then you learn that Pippin's 29. So they're technically bringing it like a high schooler with them on this
Pippin's
quest.
like 17, and he's going on a quest to save the world.
Yeah, and it explains so much about him. But basically, like, and because the hobbits are, you know, very small, they're halflings, they're just they're not meant for any of this. And Aragorn and Boromir are so, like, soft with them and patient and kind. I do actually have some photos of pages that I've sent you, because I think that the quotes on them are good. And let's see if I can find it. Okay, yeah. So this is from Return of the King, and Aragorn's kind of watching three of his buds go off to ride to, I believe, Rohan. And he says, "There go three that I love, and the smallest not the least. He knows not to what end he rides, yet if he knew, he would still go on." And I just kind of put that in there because this is a very masculine guy who's in, like, the middle of a war, who has other shit going on, and he's still openly saying he loves his friends, and he's not embarrassed about it. He's not embarrassed to say, like, I care about you, and, like, I hope that these people are safe. And those declarations of love are really just kind of the best thing. And I think well with, like, the different races in Lord of the Rings, we have, like, dwarves, which present very traditionally masculine, like, they're stout and muscular, and they have, like, beards. Even the women have beards, which is a fun point that does not get focused on enough. That's so freaking cool. And then you got the elves on the other end, who are, like, very tall and lithe and slender and very feminine. Like, they have long hair and they wear these robes. And then in between that, you have all sorts of people. And the way gender kind of comes into that, and, like, Legolas and Gimli are, you know, Legolas is an elf, Gimli's a dwarf. They really should technically hate each other, and they end up becoming really great friends, and a really wonderful kind of happy, like, development in the series, and it's really wonderful to watch that as well. So yeah, like, watching them express love for each other, and be vulnerable with each other, and be tender with each other is something that I wish people would take away from Tolkien more, instead of just like, oh, I need to world build into oblivion. It's like, well, no, what about these dynamics that are actually so precious and good?
And I think also, speaking of, like, characters showing real emotional vulnerability, and this is, like, also props to Viggo Mortensen, because every time I, like, think about this scene or watch this scene, it's insane. But it's the scene where spoilers, I guess. Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn have just discovered, like, the ravaged camp of the orcs that were holding Merry and Pippin hostage. And before they discover, like, oh, Merry and Pippin escaped into the woods, there is this beautiful moment where Aragorn kicks and I don't know if this is in the book, but like in the movies, he kicks one of the orcish helmets, and lets out this like scream of pain and anguish and just like raw emotion that is so wonderful and powerful to watch, and it's something that like you couldn't write. But what's especially like insane about that is that Viggo Mortensen fully broke his toe when he was doing that. And they were like, ah yes, this shot with all the raw emotion, and then going back and realizing this is also a man who's just in insane amounts of pain after fully breaking a bone.
Yeah.
And so I think like that adds so much depth to that scene, because it's like it translates in the movie as this like raw emotional pain. Which I think a lot of war movies show, but they kind of like shy back from a little bit. So to see something where it's like a man completely overtaken by anguish, letting it out in not like quiet tears or semi-reserved, but being like fully open in his anguish is very cool. And also
like the way that grief expresses itself. And just like again, this kind of speaks to the dedication of the cast and crew. Like, Viggo Mortensen fully made a choice in that moment not to call for a medic, not to, like, stop the scene, not to, like, wave his hands and yell cut. He decided, no, I'm gonna put this into the scene, and that is the take that you end up using. So yeah, it is great watching that and being like, wow, he fully broke his toe. That's great. Viggo Mortensen, perfect for Aragorn. What a guy.
What a guy. What a lad.
Yeah, what a lad. There's also a fun thing about, not necessarily the dedication of the cast, but just something funny that Sean Bean did. So Sean Bean, who plays Boromir, apparently hated helicopters. Problem being, they're filming on location in New Zealand for a lot of these scenes, and so they would have to take a helicopter to get on top of this mountain to film. And Sean Bean was, like, so averse to getting on that goddamn helicopter, he was like, no, I'm going to get into full Boromir outfit, full Boromir makeup, I'm gonna scale a goddamn mountain to avoid being in a helicopter.
King maneuver.
A true king maneuver. We love to see it. So yeah, that's also great. And I think we can't really have a discussion about masculinity in Lord of the Rings without also touching on, Sam and Frodo.
Yes.
Okay, so
the boys.
A lot of people ship Sam and Frodo, and I'm here to tell you, as someone who's reading the books, there's evidence for that. It's very good. Sam is Frodo's gardener, and is so devoted to him that he's like, yes, I will go to the ends of the earth for you, in a way that, like, he's the only working class hobbit that's in the adventure as well.
It's 3 aristocrats, and then this, like, manual laborer who's also there.
Yeah, and he has just this heart of absolute gold. And I mean, the ending of the series is beautiful, and I'm gonna talk about that as well. But there is this part of, I can't remember what book I took a photo of this from, but I think it's from Two Towers, because they're with Gollum. And so Frodo's just kind of asleep in, like, the middle of this very, sleep at night, in the middle of this, like, very fever dream stretch as they head towards Mount Doom to try and cast the ring into the fires on their own after the party kind of splits up. So Sam was reminded suddenly of Frodo as he had lain asleep in the house of Elrond after his deadly wound. Then, as he had kept watch, Sam had noticed that at times a light seemed to be shining faintly within, but now the light was even clearer and stronger. Frodo's face was peaceful, the marks of fear and care had left it, but it looked old and beautiful, as if the chiseling of the shaping years was now revealed in many fine lines that had before been hidden, though the identity of the face was not changed. Not that Sam Gamgee put it that way to himself. He shook his head, as if finding words useless, and murmured, I love him. He's like that, and sometimes it shines through, somehow. But I love him, whether or no. So, yeah, that is a thing that is said, and I don't care if Tolkien didn't write it gay, it reads gay.
Yep. And it's also, like, the actors, and I don't think that they were acting it that way, but it's acted so, like, yeah. There's so much homoeroticness in the way that it's acted. And especially, like, every time Sam is talking to Gollum about Frodo, it has such, like, protective energy that I love it. And it's, like...
And the thing that I love about this kind of dynamic, whether or not you want to read it as romantic or platonic, is, like, it works both ways. It works as, like, one this very, like, romantic, loving relationship between Sam and Frodo, and, like, Sam is just totally devoted to Frodo, who's, in the midst of all this suffering, and just wants to protect him from that suffering. Or it's platonic, and it's just this guy who genuinely does just love his friend that much, and is, like, okay with expressing that, and is okay with kind of feeling that strongly. So I think if you want to interpret it as, like, a kind of very complex friendship that, we don't really have room or a great label for in our society or in our understanding of friendship in, modern times, or if you want to see it as, like, kind of this love story, of this, like, very devoted person to, this person who's, like, going through a lot. It works either way, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I guess that leads into, I think, my other favorite part of Lord of the Rings that not enough people pull from, in my opinion. Frodo's job is basically to get the ring to Mount Doom, and huck it in the fire. Problem. The only reason that Frodo is really chosen for this is, one, because Bilbo had it, and Bilbo's, like, taking care of, Frodo, who is, I believe, his cousin somehow.
It's like his second cousin who died's kid, and then he took Frodo in, and they spend about a page on it at the beginning of the book, and I completely forget after reading it every time.
Listen, family relationships beyond, like, first cousin are a mystery to me, and this is from someone with a pretty big extended family. So, he's related to Bilbo, so he inherits the ring, kind of, like, Bilbo bequeaths it to him. And he also is given it because hobbits are the least likely to become a problem should the ring fully corrupt them. Because the ring is a very malevolent, powerful, arcane artifact. And the reason that both Gandalf and Galadriel freak the hell out when Frodo's like, can you not just take this? You're very strong. Like, Cate Blanchett straight up goes, like, film negative strip of just, it's terrifying.
It's insane.
Yeah, there's a reason that it's rated PG-13, because I think when I was 9 years old, that was one of the scariest parts of the movie, is when Cate Blanchett just goes, yeah. But the reason that Gandalf and Galadriel freak out, and, like, yell at Frodo when he suggests that they take it, is because they are too powerful of beings, and if the ring fell into their hands, it would corrupt that much more power, and be that much more of a threat. And hobbits are pretty low power levels. That's also part of why they can't take the eagles to Mount Doom, I believe, according to MatPat, who I'm not sure I trust a whole bunch, but, again.
And I think it's also insinuated a little bit that, like, the more, like, grandiose, it's not, like, necessarily the more noble your intentions, but the more grandiose your intentions, the more danger it is. It is to you, because it's, like, Gandalf, his point is, like, not only is he super powerful, but he has this, like, super crazy galaxy brain view of, like, the work that needs to be done in Middle-earth, and that makes the ring all the more dangerous to him, because it can draw on his, like, international, I don't know if international is the right word, but this, like, grand scale of his plans, and the reason it's so dangerous to Boromir is because it's, like, protecting an entire kingdom. And so, like, hobbits, not to say that they are small-minded, but they have, like, smaller intentions. They live in this kind of, like, closed-off, very small world, which means that the ring can't appeal to, like, some grandiose, super widespread noble desire just because the hobbits are written as not really having that.
Yeah, I mean, hobbits are just kind of very, like, small local farmer people. And, like, it wore off, like, or it didn't wear off on Bilbo. It wore Bilbo down over the years because even though he was just using it to turn invisible and play pranks, that's still, like, malevolent arcane artifact. And Frodo is a very small person who's not used to adventuring, who's, like, never really been beyond his home, who's now being hunted by ring wraiths and orcs and all manner of nasty things. For, like, what technically is 6 books. So, at the end, the logical extension of all that is, he can't do it. Frodo does not complete the prophecy. He does not pass go, does not collect $200. He falls ill. He falls prey to the wiles of the ring. And it's not him who throws it in. It's Sam. He throws Gollum.
I don't know how it's in the book. It's the Gollum bites off his finger, and in the process of biting off his finger, Frodo regains enough strength to push Gollum, and then Gollum kind of loses balance. It's a whole mess. But like the point of it is that Frodo puts on the ring and disappears from sight, and then Gollum, I guess it's insinuated that Gollum, like the ring wraith, has this inane sense of where the ring is because of how long he spent exposed to it. So Gollum, like, bites off Frodo's finger and then falls with the ring into Mount Doom. They both are consumed by the fire. Sauron dies and his tower explodes or whatever.
Yeah, big scary eyeball dies. You're right, I did completely misremember that. I was mainly fixating on the part where Frodo's like, I can't go on, Sam. And then Sam's like, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. And then that whole thing, and then the orchestra swells.
Yeah.
So yeah,
yes, that's...
Sam's devoted. He, just kind of keeps Frodo going throughout all that. And, like, literally does carry him up a volcano. A goddamn volcano.
Thank you for protecting my ears, Caroline.
Yes. He carries him up a goddamn volcano. I think as it's erupting in the movie. Or like as lava's kind of around them. I'm not sure if it's erupting, but there's definitely lava involved.
I think he carries him up. On the way up, he's carrying him as, like, the heat gets more and more insane. And as Sauron's eye is, like, scanning, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's super intense. And then Sam fights Gollum on Mount Doom with
on
his,
a very scary cliff face that's, like, very close to the lava.
As Frodo runs up to the entrance, and then Sam supports Frodo on their way back down as there is lava going everywhere, because in the movie, Mount Doom also explodes, ?
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that bit in the book, so we'll see if that does happen. But yeah, so Sam is largely the reason that the ring is destroyed. Could not have been destroyed without Sam. I think Frodo probably would have given up, and rightly so. I don't think Frodo's a wimp for, like, falling prey to the wiles of a very ancient evil force. But without Sam, I think Frodo would have given up far earlier than, would have been helpful.
Yes.
He would have given up, like, way earlier on in the series. There would not have, I'm not sure we would have gotten past, like, Two Towers. There's also a part, that I don't think I took a picture of, so I can't quote it, unfortunately. But I guess I'm going to segue into Shelob. I'm going to segue into the Shelob discourse.
I was about to say, I do also think, like, even if you can say Frodo would have traced the same journey without Sam, he would have just straight up died with Shelob, because, like, either she would have killed him, or the goblin/orcs that collected his body would have killed him.
Yeah. So, for the uninitiated, Shelob, who is actually one of my favorite characters in all of Lord of the Rings, for reasons that I shall
one of the 4 named female characters in the whole of the books.
Well, not the whole of the books. There are more in the Silmarillion.
That's true. In the whole of the 3 mainline Lord of the Rings books.
Yeah. Pedantic nerd. Anyway, Shelob is a gigantic spider, who lives in kind of the cave system around Mount Doom, I believe. Or close to it. In Mordor. General bad place.
It's the cave system at the outer wall of Mordor. 'Cause it's like, the wall where the Black Gate is, there's a cave system, and she lives in there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, see, this is helpful to have another person talking about this, because I would be getting this wrong. Again, I'm very in the weeds in terms of this, and I read the Two Towers, like, I think a year ago. So, Shelob is a gigantic spider. She is very powerful, she's very old, and she also, enjoys eating people. And as such, Gollum, who is, like, how do I even explain? He was a hobbit who was corrupted by the ring, and lives is a general little scumbag who lives around Mordor. And then Bilbo runs into him in The Hobbit, and that's how he gets the ring. And so Gollum really likes the ring, does not like that Frodo has kind of stolen his love. Stealing is not a word.
It could be.
And it's just kind of
I
like
can do a whole thing. After this, I'll do a whole thing on who Gollum is, because I remember most of his lineage, and it's like,
Okay. So anyway, Gollum is a very shifty guy who has ulterior motives, which Sam spots, king that he is,
Mhm.
And is very, Gollum's, like, kind of gotten into Frodo's heart and, like, kind of appealed to Frodo's sense of pity and mercy and general human decency. And then there's, Sam, who's like, this man's shifty as fuck.
He's actively plotting to kill you.
Yeah. Sam is then somewhat vindicated in the worst way possible when Gollum leads them into a death trap. Frodo specifically. Frodo gets got by Shelob, who Gollum is working in cahoots with to some level. And so he's...
Yeah, I think it's... So, a quick bit of context. Frodo sends Sam away because Gollum frames Sam for something, so Sam's, like, not here anymore. And then Gollum's plan is to have Shelob kill Frodo. They're not, like, friends, he's just like, she's murderous. She's murderous,
she's hungry, she probably wants a snack.
Yeah, so it's to have Shelob kill Frodo, and then take the ring. Continue.
Okay, so anyway, Frodo's been got by Shelob. So he's kind of wrapped up in this web, and she's injected her poison into him. Big ol' spider. It's a very scary part of the movie. Again, there's a reason that they're rated PG-13. It's very, very scary. So Frodo, for all intents and purposes, looks dead.
Yes.
And then Sam, somehow or another, comes across him, and it was kind of a moment in the book where reading it, I was just it is a very moving section of the book, because Sam can't process a world that does not have Frodo in it, where Frodo is not by his side, and the grief that just kind of, like, pours out of him in that moment as he kind of, like, begs for Frodo to please not be dead, as he refuses to accept this apparent reality that Frodo is dead. It's a lot. It's very emotional. It's very moving. And I will definitely try to, like, find... I'm sure someone's quoted it online, or I'll just try to, like, flip through the Two Towers and find that section. But yeah, just the amount of, like, sheer anguish, and again, vulnerability, and this, like, loss that's kind of permeating the scene was just... It was absolutely beautiful. And then Sam, because he's, I think, so faithful, I believe, again, read this, like, a year ago, so Eli, feel free to correct me. Because he, like, refuses to give up on Frodo, basically, ends up, I think, realizing that he's alive. And then ends up saving him from goblins who are coming to get him, or from Shelob. I can't remember.
So what happens is that so in the movies, and I don't know how faithful this is to the book, what happens is, he, like, sees Shelob wrapping Frodo up in, like, a cocoon of web. Then you have this whole scene where it's, like, Sam fighting Shelob. And then he opens the cocoon, sees Frodo. Frodo has, like, blue lips. He looks very dead. Sam is, like, crying because, of course he's crying. It's a very emotional thing to witness. And you don't quite see what happens, but spoiler alert, Sam takes the ring off Frodo's dead body. And then Frodo's dead, or not Frodo's dead body, but off of Frodo's body. And then a cohort of goblins and orcs show up and discover Frodo's body there. And they're like, another one of Shelob's victims. So they take his body up to, like, a bastion, I guess, one of, like, the places of the army of Mordor. And then as they're leaving, one of the goblins remarks something to the effect of, like, she essentially injects her victims to put them in, like, a comatic state to keep them, like, under control, but still alive enough so she can have them as fresh meat. And then Sam is like, Samwise Gamgee, you fool. And he says that to himself. And every time I'm like, dude, you had literally no way to know that this was her plan.
Frodo and Sam are very hard on themselves. It's kind of a thing. It's okay. We love them so much.
And then Sam leads a one-man assault on the tower and the bastion, and I think instigates, like, infighting that essentially kills everyone. Or no, it's not that. It's that an orc and a goblin are fighting over Frodo's armor. A orc gets thrown out of a window. This instigates a civil war at this bastion between goblins and orcs that kills almost everyone, providing the opening for Sam to lead his one-man assault on, like, the last 4 surviving people in here. And then he rescues Frodo, who's not dead.
I believe that is more or less faithful to what happens in the book. I will say that, the one part of it that I think couldn't have been included in the movies, is where Sam and Frodo's, like, been wrapped up and looks dead, and Sam just stays with him as he's saying all this, he stays with him for several hours and then kind of scoots away when he hears the goblins coming, and then he overhears the thing, and then everything else happens. Yeah. But yes, Sam and Frodo, very good friendship, very good friendship in general. And I think another thing, I mean, we basically spoiled the ending of the whole series, but, like, it's also been out for 60 plus years if you count the books, and 20-ish years if you count the movies. So you really have no excuse at this point to at least not know the basic plot points. But after everything is destroyed, and when they're sailing off to Tolkien's analog for heaven, I think, it's complicated.
Elf heaven.
Elf heaven.
Just elf heaven. No one else gets to go except for Gandalf, Bilbo, and Frodo.
And I think Gimli as well. I think the whole fellowship manages to get on board or something. But yeah, like, when they're sailing off, so we kind of get to see, like, right before that happens, there's sort of an epilogue moment where we see Frodo as he's kind of recovered-ish from the whole ordeal. And Frodo, to put it mildly, is still fucked up. He's got a physical wound that's not going away because he got stabbed by the Nazgul or the Ringwraith, or that is...
The Nazgul and the Ringwraith. He was stabbed by, and I'm sure that the name has, but, like, essentially they're curse blades. A piece of the curse blade broke off inside of his shoulder, and it's, like, this wound that can never heal, which is an analog for veterans who, like, get wounds that don't heal.
Yeah. And, Frodo's kind of been writing down his adventures, but he's still, clearly he's different. He comes back and he's, he's been psychologically affected by it, clearly. He's still very traumatized, he's kind of depressed. He is just not the way that he was, before he went on the adventure. He's kind of traumatized, in a way that's, I think, really heartbreaking to watch, but also, again, I wish more storytellers would incorporate that, of kind of seeing the toll that, doing all of this and taking those risks and being in that incredibly intense situation, particularly for someone who's lived a very comfortable life up until that point, like, kind of documenting that toll and that damage that does, instead of just being like, and then everything's fine, and y'all go home, and, like, the people who need to be king are king, and, like, the people who aren't, and the bad guys are dead, and everything's fine. And it's like, well, no. Like, obviously there will be side effects after this. There are going to be repercussions for this, like, going forward. So yeah, that's also a thing that I like. Just kind of like, the heroes fuck up and are fucked up and do not always do the right thing, and that does not make them any less important. That does not make them, I think, weak, or at the very least, it does not make them, worthy of aspersions or disdain. It just makes them people. And that's a kind of humanity that I really wish that, more storytellers of epic tales would, kind of incorporate.
Yeah. I think it's also, and I don't know about the books at the ending, but in the movies, I believe it's only, so in the movies, it is only Gandalf, Bilbo, and Frodo who sail to the Grey Havens, and there's this really, like, sad, beautiful but sad moment, where it's the four hobbits at the docks, and, like, they have not been told that Frodo's leaving, so they think that they're just saying goodbye to Bilbo. And so watching that, like, the last interaction of Sam and Frodo, it gets me every time. And it hurts.
Yeah. I think,
stuff hurts.
After the movies end, I believe, in canon, that the rest of them do go off to join them, but I may have misremembered that entirely. I do think that, like, a bunch of exceptions definitely were made, and, like, only elves can go to the Grey Havens, because I think it's definitely more than just Frodo and Bilbo.
Yeah. And I think the movies maybe dramatized
goodbye.
it. Yes.
Because, again, it's like Sam's confronted with this reality where Frodo is not with him. And it's really heartbreaking to kind of see him internalize it and, like, oh, it's for real now. So, yeah. But I guess we do need to circle back to Shelob at that point. Because I said I was going to talk about her. I'm going to talk about her. So we mentioned that Tolkien wasn't great about including a whole bunch of women in his stories. This means that the women that he does include are absolutely kick-ass. They're great. They lead... I think Tolkien directly contributed to the trope of strong, competent women in fantasy save the heroes multiple times throughout the course of the story in a way that is absolutely great. So I'm going to see if I can locate exactly the passage on Shelob. So again, this is a gigantic spider lady. She is often not, valued as a female character I think, she shows up in The Hobbit, I believe. Yes, because she gets the dwarves. She gets the dwarves, and then Bilbo has to, like, cut them all down.
Isn't that the giants? That's the people who, like, tie up all the dwarves, is the 3 trolls who then get turned to stone.
One second.
I don't think, unless Shelob is, like, in a completely different place, the Hobbit doesn't go close to, I don't think the Hobbit ever gets close enough to, like, Mordor! That's the word. I don't think the Hobbit ever gets close enough to Mordor for her to show up.
Okay. I feel like I remember something different from that. She may have just been in the forest at that point, but whatever.
Oh, there were giant spiders in the forest, but I don't think it was Shelob. I think it was just, like, other big spiders.
Oh, her kids. Anywho. So, Shelob isn't often counted among the ranks of female characters in Lord of the Rings, which I think is an absolute travesty, because she is sentient, she is a female, and she is a very strong female character, something that that is never really addressed in the books, because it's, like, the backstory that, those writers tend to do. But she's obscenely powerful, it turns out. This is something that Tolkien says in The Two Towers. There, age-long she had dwelt, an evil thing in spider form, even such as once of old had lived in the land of elves in the west that is now under the sea. Lots of history. How Shelob came to Mordor, flying from ruin, no tale tells, for out of the dark years few tales have come. But still she was there, who was there before Sauron, the big bad, there before the first stone of Barad-dûr, and she served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat, with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow. For all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of miserable mates, her own offspring, that she slew, spread from glen to glen. But none could rival her, Shelob the Great, last child of Ungoliant, to trouble the unhappy world. So basically, she's an obscenely powerful spider god, who, instead of opting for world domination, has just chosen to stay in her house and eat goblin hot pockets.
Yes.
What an icon!
So yeah, the spiders that they encounter in Mirkwood are her descendants. They're one of, like, her bastardized descendants that are mentioned in that passage.
Yeah, so those are her kids.
Those are kids, yes. No, Shelob doesn't get a lot of screen time in the movies. I mean, she does. There's, like, a whole scene where it's, like, her presence is felt, but she's not, like, actively on screen. So I don't know that much about her, but she sounds cool. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Smeagol, years before, Gollum had beheld her, Smeagol who pried into all dark holes, and in past days he had bowed and worshipped her. So they do know each other.
They do know each other.
He has a relationship with her. But yeah, so she's just like, I'm content to dwell in my house and just eat things all day. Which is, I think,
a mood.
Such a great departure from, like, there's this, saying that, like, women have to work twice as hard as men to achieve the same recognition, and she's just opted out of that sexist system completely. She's like, actually, I'm just gonna stay here. I'm just gonna I'm not even gonna try. I don't give a shit about, like, climbing the ladder. I don't care about, getting a higher rank. I'm just gonna eat my food and stay in my room. And that's all I'm gonna do. Like,
I love that.
Yeah, it's such a low-pressure existence. Like, the amount of self-care and self-love that goes into that lifestyle is truly something that I admire and aspire to. So, yeah. Strong female characters in fantasy are great, and I am a Shelob apologist, as the description says.
Yes. I was just gonna say, I realized that I never got back to explaining who Gollum is, which is, like, I don't know, he feels like one of those characters where it's, like, such a weird and long history of things got him to be where he is. But now that we're talking about Gollum's past, essentially the short version was Gollum was a hobbit, except in sometimes they're like, he was like a hobbit. They won't say he's a hobbit. They say he's river folk, which look and act like hobbits, but aren't hobbits.
Yeah, it turns out hobbits is, like, the localized Shire name for halflings.
Yeah.
Like, hobbits call themselves hobbits because they live in the Shire, but outside of that, their actual name is halflings.
Yes. So he is a river folk who, not actually him, but someone else in his life found the ring. Okay. Lineage of the ring. The ring, cut from Sauron's finger at the last great battle between men and elves on one side and Sauron's forces on the other side. Aragorn's great old ancestor, picked up the ring, put it on, got super corrupted by it. Eventually, the ring, tricked him into essentially drowning himself in a river, and then the ring was lost to the riverbed. Many years later, Gollum's associate friend, someone who he calls my love, which is, another, little thing that I was like, this is kind of both, a thing that British people do, so I can kind of understand where it comes from, but, he doesn't sound British, so it seems kind of homoerotic. Discovers the ring, picks it up, then Gollum chokes him to death, and takes the ring for himself. At this point, Gollum is called Smeagol. Smeagol is then out, not exercised, but forced out of his family
Exiled.
because, he's a murderer. He goes to not the Lonely Mountain, but another mountain that is encountered on the trip in The Hobbit, where the, goblins, I believe, later come to inhabit.
Misty Mountains?
I think it's in the Misty Mountains. I don't know if it has a specific name. I just know that it's, when the goblins capture the party is when Bilbo first encounters Gollum. So Gollum escapes into these mountains and lives underground for 500 years in possession of the ring, goes crazy, loses all his hair, and becomes obsessed with riddles. Yeah, and his teeth. And becomes obsessed with riddles.
He makes a Gollum noise in his throat, hence the name.
Yes. So I think it's he can no longer say the name Smeagol, or he has trouble with it. And so it's this really terrible noise, but he goes home, home, and then people start calling him Gollum. He then eventually encounters Bilbo, and Bilbo wins the ring off of him, or wins his life in a game of riddles, and then steals the ring.
Accidentally. He finds it and then realizes that it's Gollum's, and he's like, well, I'm not giving this back.
Yeah, it's mine now. And then, so he takes the ring, then Gollum somehow ends up in Mordor, where he is tortured into revealing the name Bilbo Baggins, and that's how the ring wraiths come to track Frodo, and so begins the whole Lord of the Rings story. And there's a great piece of foreshadowing, or two great pieces of foreshadowing, because one, Gandalf talks about pitying Gollum, which then becomes a whole problem. And then also Gandalf is we can't kill him. He has a role yet to play, which is the most obvious piece of foreshadowing in the history of any movie ever. But Gollum is the one who destroys the ring, so perhaps it is justified.
Yeah. And then, he ends up meeting Frodo and Sam, and Sam and Gollum have a contentious relationship. And I think something great that someone once said in terms of, describing Tolkien as a person and as a writer, in the movies, they had to, I think, construct a lot of the battle scenes kind of from whole cloth, because they're just not described that much. The entire conversation where Sam explains the wondrous qualities of potatoes, is lifted verbatim from the book.
Yep.
Sam, it's just a great little speech, and I could never do it justice. I can't do a West Country accent to save my life, but I recommend you look it up on YouTube, Shelby. Slash whoever else is watching.
It's so fun. It's also, a lot of the battle scenes, they are constructed a little bit, but they are constructed fully through the lens of, one character or a very small part of the battle, which means that, the crazy, intense, fight at Helm's Deep, is not... I mean, you may see it through the eyes of a couple characters, but you don't see this, super intense blowing up walls and throwing people off the edge of parapets and stuff.
Tolkien clearly did not think that the battle scenes were the most important scenes. He was like, the potatoes are where it's at.
The potatoes and the anti-industrialization message, which is... If you ever watch it and you're wondering, why is the White Tower like that? It's because Tolkien hated industrialization.
Yeah. So, that's kind of, I guess, our, little favorite bits of Lord of the Rings. What with the expression of masculinity and the strong female characters. There are more strong female characters than just Shelob. There's, Arwen, who's great, and Kick-Ass.
You have to talk about Arwen.
I do have to talk about Arwen. Okay, so... We've kind of mentioned this before offhand, but Frodo did get stabbed at some point by ring wraiths, and this is bad. This is very bad. And this does also lead to, like, some tender scenes where, like, everyone's kind of trying to take care of him, and Aragorn's very concerned, which is very sweet. And they're like, well, we gotta get this boy to Rivendell and stat!
So Lord Elrond can hear him.
Yeah,
heal him.
Elrond, yeah. So, like, the elves can help him out and, you know, get all of this stuff there. So, you know, Frodo's unconscious for a lot of this, because he's very injured and very weak.
Yes.
But somehow or another, they bundle him off, like, running from these evil entities that are, like, after the ring. Yes, Eli's doing, like, a little running motion while sitting down. And they finally get him to Arwen, and Arwen's on, like, this one side of the river, that kind of separates that's, like, one of the borders of Rivendell, I believe. Again, this is from a very long time ago rewatch. I'm just remembering the cool part. And so all of these ring wraiths are kind of standing at the edge of the river, and they're like, hand him over, she-elf. And Arwen just looks them dead in the eye and goes, if you want him, come and claim him. And then summons some, like, horses made out of literal water to come charging at the ring wraiths and completely sweeps them away and knocks them out. And that is her, basically, introduction. She's also Aragorn's, like, I guess technically fiancé. It's a whole thing.
Yes.
Half-elves are complicated in Lord of the Rings, like, way more complicated than in D&D. And there's a lot of drama with that. So yeah, that's basically her introduction, is saving Frodo's ass by summoning water horses. She's very cool.
So it's even more than that, because what it is that she essentially rides out to meet the group. Like, Aragorn's like, God, I wish someone would come help us. And then Arwen is like, hello, it is me, Arwen.
She's like, hey, babe.
So it's that she, at one point, he's like, you stay with them, I'll carry on ahead. And she stops him and she's like, we both know I'm a better horse rider. Sit down. And then there's this, like, before the water scene, there's this really intense scene where you see Arwen keeping Frodo up on a horse while also riding a horse at full tilt, being surrounded and chased by all 9 of the Nazgul. So there are 9 of the Dark Riders just chasing her, and then she, like, fully sprints this horse across the stream, and then does what Caroline just described. So it's a very... Hi, Pepper. My dog has come and joined us.
Oh, yay! Hi, Pepper.
There's this very intense, like, series of scenes where she's just a badass, and everyone is impressed. I was impressed. I was like, this is a very cool woman.
Yes. And she's just generally cool. It's also very funny listening to Arwen's voice in the movie, which is, like, very, you know, deep and, like, kind of ageless and, like, clearly very ancient. And then you listen to Liv Tyler's voice, and it's so high-pitched and peppy. It's so funny. Like, the actress who plays Arwen is, like, such a pure bean in real life, and it's so cute to see. But yeah, Arwen's a badass, quite possibly one of my first childhood crushes. Good shit. Yeah, she's great and very pretty and super cool. She has a sword.
Yes.
Awesome.
She does. It's very cool. I suppose now that we're talking about elves,
we gotta talk about our elf crushes.
Okay. So I don't even know where to start with this. My elf crush is Legolas. I would say, not even my elf crush, just probably one of the first people who I was like, very hot, very, very attractive.
Amazing.
And I think it's like, there's so many things. The first thing is that Legolas, like most elves, is, I don't want to say necessarily, like, androgynous presenting, but is, like, elves in general are I can't say, like, on the scale of elf presentation, but elves in general are pretty, like, female-coded androgynous is probably the best way of putting it.
They all have long hair and wear very flowy robes.
Yeah, long hair, like, very...
light features.
Yeah, tradition, like, what would probably be considered a traditionally, like, feminine silhouette in a lot of their clothing. Very pretty, very fine featured, yes, as all the things Caroline was saying. But what is very good about Legolas is a lot of things. I don't know why I said it like that. I think one of my favorite things about him as a character, as I've expressed to Caroline before, is that he's the kind of person who in one scene will say a bunch of high elven bullshit that is, like, oh, the trees, and the blah, 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 whatever. And then in the next scene, you'll watch him, like, ice 3 people in a row, like, in what would be 1 round of combat in D&D, just, like, murder 3 orcs with his bow. And 2 very attractive things that I am obsessed with. But it was originally just Legolas, and I was like, if it's just Legolas, that's fine. And then I watched Pirates of the Caribbean, and I was like, oh no, it's Orlando Bloom anytime he has long or, like, medium long hair. I don't know what it is about this man. I don't find him attractive just generally, but as soon as he has, like, mid to long hair, I'm like, So, I mean, I can talk about Legolas, but I can't just start talking about him. I think I have to be asked questions, and then I can probably defend my opinions on Legolas.
Alright, now I gotta think of Legolas interview questions. Cool. Thoughts on, his relationship with Aragorn, I guess? I don't know.
I think it's like, okay. So, comes to the point where it's also important for me to say, I acknowledge and can fully respect the fact that Viggo Mortensen is, like, an objectively like, if you are attracted to men, if that's, like, a thing, I can accept the fact that, like, he's objectively attractive. I can look at him and be like, attractive man. But for none of the other characters make me feel the way Legolas makes me feel. I do think it's the interesting, like, the thing about their relationship is that they're, like, just friends, and it's very cool that they're just friends. And then you see, like, I think the one scene that, like, embodies what I really love about their relationship is after Aragorn goes over the cliff, when they're fighting Uruk-hai, I believe, on the trip to Helm's Deep in the second movie. There's this, like, very sad scene where it's, like, Legolas is essentially, like, pleading with the people around him to be like, we have to look for Aragorn's body, we have to find him, and the King of Rohan is like, we can't waste time on the dead. And it's like, that scene just hurts me every time.
Yeah.
It's like, he just wants to find his friend.
Okay.
But also, like, 2 very competent fighters who are also good friends and have emotional vulnerability. And I think the funniest thing in the movies is that they very clearly show Legolas, like, knock over a tower of orcs and kill, like, 40 people in about 5 seconds. But then when Legolas and Gimli are doing their, like, counts, he'll be like, oh, I killed 60 people. And I was like, I think I saw you kill 60 people in, like, the 5 minutes of screen time you had, so clearly they didn't care about the continuity of actual deaths, which is very funny to me.
Yeah. So yeah, and I guess going off of that, combat, Legolas, archery, thoughts?
I have expressed, I think archery is very hot. I think watching people do archery is hot. It's a thing. And Legolas is really good at it. He is, like, there's so many scenes in the movies where you're just watching Legolas, like, stand there, and people charge at him, and he's just, like, repeatedly shooting them with his bows, and I'm like, this man is too good. It's too good watching him just, like, not move, look completely nonchalant, and be icing, like, 20 orcs.
Yeah.
In 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, what else?
Well, I will ask you Arwen questions.
Okay, cool.
So, she's very big in the first movie, and maybe in the first book, but after that she kind of, like, I don't know, I think a lot of her in the movies is based off of her relationship to Aragorn.
Yeah.
So, outside of that, how else would you have liked to have seen her have a role in the movies outside of the context of that relationship? Or did you enjoy seeing her in the context of that relationship?
Yeah, I think generally, like, seeing her kind of, like, her scenes with, like, her dad where she's kind of confronting him are really great. Because the thing about Elrond, who is Arwen's dad, is that he, I think at some point, like, kind of helped raise Aragorn. Aragorn's a half-elf. Yeah. He's lived for a while. It's a whole thing. But he's not necessarily supportive of Arwen choosing to give up her immortality to be with Aragorn, because Aragorn's gonna die at some point. And he knows this, and he's like, well, you know, like, I looked into your future and I saw death, and then Arwen has a vision as she's kind of being led away with all the other, like, I guess, women and children of the elves, before the big battle. Or battles. like, she kind of has a vision of her future with Aragorn, and she sees that she has a kid, and she kind of goes back to her dad, like, goes back to Rivendell, where it's, like, objectively not safe, where people are, like, preparing for war, and she just, like, completely just eviscerates this man, like, you did not tell me that I was gonna have a kid, you jerk!
You lied to me!
Yeah, like, you lied to me, like, you completely skewed this decision, like, I'm going to keep fighting for this relationship and these people that I care about, and that's, I think, a tenacity that I very much admire. So just kind of seeing her, like, as well, just kind of in her, like, maybe a position of strategy or something, because, you know, she has the ability to at least communicate with Aragorn through dreams, I think, a little bit. Or maybe that's just something he does when he's comatose. I can't remember.
No, I think that they are having a conversation.
Yeah. So they're...
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, you know, using that ability somehow, maybe, or just generally, like, I don't know, seeing basically an elf princess kind of operate and lead her people into battle, not unlike, like, at least join in the fight, kind of like Eowyn had, I think would be really cool. Just seeing her be more involved generally with, like, either strategy or command or, you know, kind of using that rank, would be really neat. But yes, seeing her fight would be cool, too. I think she's mainly a sword gal. But maybe she does archery. Maybe that's just, like, a class that elf children have to take in elf school.
I mean, isn't it, I guess in D&D, like, all elves, or is it all elves or just high elves? But, like, some class of elves have automatic proficiency in, like, short sword, longbow, and short bow. Like, that's just a thing that elves know how to do, and it's like, yeah. Canon.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, I don't know. I would also say, like, it's very interesting thinking about the brain empty. Eowyn is a very interesting character to me, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
And I don't know what it's like in the books, but her relationship with the concept of war is very interesting and kind of something that, like, I think could have come off as very patronizing, and at times does come off as a little bit patronizing, the way that it's written, but is also, like, very honest, and I think is reflective of the way that a lot of young soldiers, not necessarily young female soldiers, just young soldiers in general, look at war, which is very good. I enjoy it. I enjoy that whole dynamic.
Yeah, and I think Eowyn, as a character, is also very great. I think one of my favorite moments as a kid watching the movies, again, keeping in mind that, like, I was not into Lord of the Rings, I decided against it, and I was pretty, you know, I held some antipathy towards it, but the scene where Eowyn, okay, I guess, backing up, Eowyn is the female heir to Rohan, and she is kind of, like, Rohan has kind of been falling apart for a while now. She has not lived a comfortable life. She's always, like, the person who is technically kind of taken over for her uncle.
Yes.
Yeah. Her uncle, Theoden, who rules Rohan, Grima Worktongue, is super sleazy and definitely has a thing for her and is not subtle about it, which is a thing that she hates. So she's always kind of grown up in this very unstable, not fun environment. So she doesn't really have, like, she doesn't have the room to be feminine. She doesn't have that, like, kind of space to be like, oh, I'm gonna be delicate and kind of, you know, stay inside and all that. So she very much wants to get involved when Rohan's finally saved from Grima/Sauron and Theoden is kind of back to normal, as, you know, cool uncle dude. She wants to go off and join the war, and they're like, well, no, you can't do that, because, you know, you're a girl and you're, like, Aragorn has this whole conversation with her, like, your role isn't to go and fight, it's to keep Rohan safe while we're away. And she's emphatically against it. And she ends up, along with Merry, one of the hobbits, two people who are, like, objectively pretty unsuited for battle, riding into the Battle of Helm's Deep. She kicks ass, disguised as a man, kind of like Mulan style. And then she runs into the Witch King, who's one of this, like, secondary big bads.
Yeah, he's the primary Nazgul.
The primary Nazgul.
The king of the Nazgul.
And this guy is scary as fuck. And this is the second time that he gets his ass kicked by a woman because he goes, no man can defeat me. And she removes her helmet and says, I am no man, and then stabs him in the goddamn face. And kills him. And oh my god, it's the best thing ever. I think, like, just looking at it, I didn't have a concept of what feminism was, but I was like, the only term I think I had for feminism was at that point, like, girl power. So it's just like, girl power and wordplay? Like, my heart! It was like two of my favorite things rolled into one in a very kick-ass scene. So again, Tolkien doesn't write a lot of women, but the ones he does write, do pretty important shit.
Yeah, I think it's also, like, I believe she not only gets to kill the Witch King, which is, like, this character who's routinely showed up and fucked people up, but she also gets to kill the, like, and I don't know if this is in the books, but it's definitely in the movies, the orc general who either is directly responsible or in, like, one way or another is responsible for the eventual death of Theoden, is, like, also, she just gets to stab him, and he's, like, dead at her hand, too, which is very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many, like, awesome moments in that final battle. I think my favorite, getting back to Legolas, is there's this one where, it's, like, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn are just kind of standing in the middle. They're fighting, but they're in the middle of this battlefield, and Aragorn looks over at, like, one of these, not an elephant, an olifant, which is, like, a giant war machine on an elephant, and he just, like, looks at Legolas and is like, handle that, and Legolas just goes and knocks out this elephant and, like, the 30 people riding on its back, which is very cool, but I also have to laugh every time, because it's a little bit ridiculous.
Handled. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff that goes on. I guess circling back to cool elf ladies, then there's Galadriel, who's pretty cool. Again, one of the competent women in fantasy saving our hero's ass. And she was played by Cate Blanchett, who, as a lesbian, I kind of obliged to swear fealty to.
You must be loyal to her.
Yeah. She, like, had an Instagram live or something. She's like, I guess I'm a lesbian now? Just kind of in reaction, like, people online saying that she is. And she was in an Instagram live with Sarah Paulson as well, who, it was just great. So Cate Blanchett, just great. Super cool. And Galadriel's just a super powerful elf lady who, I don't think she's one of, well, first of all, she's Arwen's grandma, which is never brought up directly in the books, but or, like, in the movies, but yeah, she's related to Arwen. She's Elrond's mom, I think. Or maybe, oh wait, no, I think she's Arwen's mom's mom. And Arwen's mom doesn't show up, for a reason I'm forgetting. Arwen also has two older brothers who just don't show up except very briefly. Like, they get less screen time than she does, and I think that is an excellent example of, like...
I think the only time you see them on screen is, like, when they're standing behind her, when she reappears, like, at Aragorn's confirmation. The thing where you become king. It's not called... That's it. I think you just see them behind her at that, and that's the only time I remember.
Yeah, are they ever named as well? Like, are they ever referenced, or is it just, like, if you know who they are, you know?
You know, I think it's, like, if you know who they are, you know who they are. And also, it could just be two random elves who, like, happen to look very similar.
So yeah, Galadriel is a very powerful elf. I think Gimli develops a crush on her, which is very funny. The party kind of stays with her for a while in the woods, as one does. With her
while they grieve Gandalf.
Yeah. And they grieve Gandalf. And as they're leaving, she, like, gives them gifts and stuff, 'cause, you know, can't stay with, cool, powerful people if they don't give you things to help with your journey. Or they get a bunch of cool things, and they have the ability to request certain things, and the only thing that Gimli asks for is a lock of her hair.
Well, isn't it actually that he's like, I ask for nothing except to look, like, he says, I can't do his voice, I ask for nothing except to look upon your fair face one more time, like, the horniest thing he could say. And then he's like, actually, can I have one piece, like, one strand of hair? Yeah. And then in the boat, he's like, she gave me 3.
And it's like, oh,
and it's so ridiculous.
Gimli's... Yeah, so, I mean, big same. If I ran into Cate Blanchett, would probably do the same thing. Cannot promise that I would do anything different. She's just very cool, and she's, you know, super powerful and great and generally awesome. And I think is, again, kind of like the progenitor of the trope of cool, powerful women showing up and then giving you things and then just kind of sending you off. Like, yeah, I have the ability to do all this cool shit. Have some stuff.
Here you go. Now please exit my homeland.
Yes.
Get gone. Yeah, no, it's great. That's a great series of scenes that happen. Yeah, no, I think that definitely there are some, like, really awesome, just, like, characters who show up once and then aren't referenced again. And it's, like, they exist. I was gonna say, I think that, like, on the subject of Gandalf and that whole series of things, that's still, like, one of the most just, like, I think one of the most badass deaths, or not even deaths, because he doesn't really die. He, like, falls through all 9 levels of hell and then kills the Balrog, and it's, like, very funny. But, like, I think every time no scene in Lord of the Rings can give me chills multiple times, except for the scene where, Gandalf, like, sacrifices himself. Because every time I'm like, feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole scene is just, like, very good. I think I was gonna say something else about that, but, oh yeah, I guess just for context, oh yeah! I remember what I was gonna say. So, as I've mentioned, Lord of the Rings movies, rated PG-13. This technically means that they can have 1 F-bomb in there, per movie, and I personally think that scene would be greatly improved if Gandalf said, "You shall not pass, motherfucker!"
Like, put a Nick Fury and just... That would have been great. I think it's also, on the subject of Tolkien and, like, the things that he chooses not to include, I don't think anyone actually uses, like, any swears in that whole, or they don't use what would be considered swear words by our standards, which brings me to the subject of a post where it was someone being like, how can you write a fantasy book set in a world that is completely different from our own and, like, what words do you have to not use? And then I think, like, Tolkien, especially in dialogue, just completely made his own, like, here's all of our things we reference in our everyday, which is very good. Because I also think, like, for all that they talk about death and suffering, no one ever mentions, like, the concept of hell, which is something that I think you could very well would have made a lot of sense to be brought up in this book, but, like, in a world without Christianity, or without, like, the Abrahamic religions, you don't really have a concept of hell. And so I think for all that, like, hell is very comparable to a lot of the things they experience, especially Mordor, to be able to have a book that completely doesn't reference that as an idea, even, like, in a war novel, is very, very good and interesting.
Yeah, and I think, again, it kind of goes back to Tolkien wanted to create something similar to a mythology for, like, England and the British Isles that wasn't King Arthur, because that's basically what you have. Like, you have the Knights of the Round Table, but that's, a lot of it's centered on Christianity and, like, this search for the Holy Grail, and so he just wanted to do something that was completely divorced from Christianity and completely divorced from, like, any recognizable religion, which is really cool. And also led to, like, the creation of several tiers of gods, just, which are, again, explained in the Silmarillion, not really in the actual books, but yeah, Gandalf is, I believe, technically a god, as are the Eagles, which is, again, part of why they don't take the Eagles to Mount Doom. I know it would be the easier thing to do, but there's a lot of reasons in the lore that are legitimate that, like, I, who am very nitpicky, can understand. So yeah. Yeah, they got eagle gods and they got wizard gods and all sorts of other things.
All sorts of deities and such. And then all sorts of deities and such, and yet I think that, like, the concept of worship, or, like, the idea of gods is just disappeared. They don't come up. Yeah,
they're not worshipped. There's, I don't think, any religion that's really mentioned, except maybe, like, religious rites for, like, funerals and whatnot, because, you know, you still do have those. But those are, like, we, like, you know, in Gondor, spoiler alert, Boromir dies, which I think we've covered already, but Boromir dies and then Denethor finds out who's Boromir's dad, and Boromir was obviously the favorite. Denethor's just a jerk.
Yeah. Poor
and
Faramir.
Denethor kind of loses it, and then poor Faramir, who's Boromir's brother and a very good boy, who's not the favorite, despite trying his best all the time. It's great. But I also, that reminds me, I do have the Denethor and Gandalf related quote. This isn't so much like a moment of vulnerability from male characters, so much as just, like, with Sam and Frodo, I feel like homoerotic isn't necessarily the right word, because it's not sexual
It's not
in
erotic.
any nature.
It's
not
just
erotic. It's just, like, very romantic and loving. And then there's this part in this conversation where Gandalf and Denethor are arguing. And there's this passage, Denethor turned his dark eyes on Gandalf, and now Pippin saw a likeness between the two, and he felt the strain between them, almost as if he saw a line of smoldering fire, drawn from eye to eye, that might suddenly burst into flame. Can you write it gayer?
Oh,
there's a
out of
fire
context,
line
that sounds like
between
something
their
out of
eyes.
like that sounds like something out of a fanfic if it was not like in the context of two people who absolutely do not want to be in each other's presences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think anytime, yeah, I think that with Faramir and Boromir, it's very cool to see a relationship where it's like two brothers whose father, I think like the closest comparison is maybe like Thor and Loki in DC, if that like makes sense. Not like Thor and Loki actually, because they're not brothers, and then like not DC, why am I saying DC? Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
Marvel kind of screwed up their actual relationship.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's very interesting because I think a lot of the times when you have like two brothers where one is consistently being placed above and is being like used to belittle the other, you see this like very, very realistic trend towards like hatred or at the very least resentment. And so it's very refreshing to watch the way that Boromir and Faramir are played, especially in the movies, where it's like, for all that Boromir is kind of constantly used as an icon and image to belittle and put down and very actively endanger Faramir's life, Faramir never stops, like, loving his brother and is clearly, like, very torn up and devastated by his death, which I think is a very good reversal on the normal trope for, like, brothers whose parents don't love them the same.
Yeah. And I think Boromir as well also doesn't really, kind of refuses to play into that. He doesn't, like, he pushes back against Denethor, constantly pitting them against each other. He's like, no, he's doing good. He's doing good. So yeah, like, brothers who love each other in spite of shitty parents. Very good.
Very good.
Yeah. So, yeah. I think I forgot what we were talking about. Whoops. But yeah, Boromir's cool. Boromir, I think, like, the first time I watched Lord of the Rings, I was like, he's a dick, because he tries to, like, get the ring from Frodo. And that does lead to his imminent demise, but kind of looking back on it, like, well, no, I get it. Like,
yeah,
he's just a flawed character, who's, like, you know, just wants to protect his homeland the best way he knows how. It's kind of, he's trying to do it out of altruism, even though he has ulterior motives, which is, like, a weird, complex thing to figure out, but he's a weird, complex person, as most people are. And I think, you know, having him included was important, and I think, again, that's a demonstration of just, like, the different ranges of, like, masculinity and vulnerability and courage that's present in these books. It was really cool to witness.
I think it's also, like, what is true about Boromir is that for all that, like, in that I can respect his choice and I can understand him as a character, is that it gets back into that same, like, the ring, more than anything else, plays off of, like, noble intentions or intentions to do good. And, like, I think out of everyone in the party, Boromir most clearly is in it to do good and to save people. Like, a lot of the other members of the party, they're like, oh, we're going to save Middle-earth, but, Boromir has, like, the most direct stake. He has the most, like, skin in the fight. And so I think to have the character who, more than anyone else, is, like, it's very prescient for him to want to save, to want to end the Scourge of Mordor because it's, like, 50 miles from the place he grew up. I think it makes his story all the more tragic when, like, he had the most reason to be fighting this war, and, like, to see him be the one who is first corrupted by the ring and is completely, like, brought low by it is very sad to watch.
Yeah. And I think it just kind of serves, it's also, like, I think a great sort of early demonstration of what the ring can do and kind of the danger that it poses even to people with great intentions. And that kind of sets up, like, Frodo's own kind of falling to it in a really great way, because it's like, well, no, it's not, like, if you're evil, then you're gonna, like, you know, obviously want to use this. Like, good people who mean well can also, be weaponized by the ring and fall victim to it in a very dangerous way. And Boromir, regrets it when he realizes that he's freaking out the Hobbit. He realizes he's freaking out Frodo and he backs off and he tries to apologize. Which is also, just heartbreaking to watch. So again, just, I forgive the lack of female characters just because the male characters that are present are just, they're, vulnerable, and they get sad and they mess up and they own it when they mess up. They don't I didn't, do anything wrong, no, I have noble intentions. They don't, get overly defensive. Boromir knows that he fucked up, and he tries to make it up to Frodo, and then he dies, before he can, which is sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also, the Tolkien's books are very unforgiving on the feelings and on, it's not something that, at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like it's meant to be a feel-good story. It's meant to be, a feel story. You walk away feeling emotions, not necessarily, happy or sad, but just with this, greater understanding of the world and of the people in it, which is, I think, a very noble thing to do with a book. Because I think it would be very easy to write in, as we were talking about earlier, for Frodo, he doesn't really get a happy ending. He gets freed from this, scourge of the ring, but he is still in daily pain. He still is dealing with this constantly. And I think it's very easy for fantasy writers to fall back on, and then they all lived happily ever after. But the tone of the book wouldn't really allow for that. And I think Tolkien sticking to his guns and not kind of giving into the traditional, happy ending makes it a much stronger and a much more beloved series.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as well, that kind of also speaks to the Hobbit, the Hobbit trilogy's failings is that, they tried to treat it the same as The Lord of the Rings, and it's not. The Hobbit's a bedtime story. It's meant for kids, as evidenced by the fact that Bilbo doesn't come home with PTSD as far as we know. Or if it does, it's not mentioned. We just see, he comes home, and then the next time we see him in Lord of the Rings, he's having a birthday party and turning invisible.
Yep.
As well he should. So yeah, I think treating them the same is, it is also very interesting to read The Hobbit, because I read The Hobbit kind of after I read The Two Towers, because I didn't have Return of the King yet, or, the edition that I wanted. So, reading that kind of and comparing it with Lord of the Rings kind of in the middle of it is very interesting. And, hello, gentle listeners. Editing Caroline here for Hey Nerd's first ever Correction Corner. In the upcoming clip, I talk about an interpretation of Tolkien's work that I saw online, and which influenced my own reading of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The interpretation in question was that Tolkien, unconsciously or not, coded the dwarves as Jewish in The Hobbit through the use of negative stereotypes, which he recanted after World War II while writing Lord of the Rings. It turns out that information is from an academic article, but an old one. More recent literature on the matter paints a much more complex picture. While Tolkien did draw from Jewish culture and Semitic languages when designing the dwarves, it looks far more likely that he did so from a place of respect and appreciation. I will, of course, include the relevant articles and timestamps in the timestamp doc, which you can find in the episode description below, and I deeply apologize for spreading hurtful misinformation. I promise to be more responsible moving forward. Alright, on with the episode. I've heard this online. I don't know how true it is, but someone floated online that, the dwarves are actually, in The Hobbit, are painted as, a very anti-Semitic caricature, and reading it, I can see where you would get that from. Because it's they're, greedy and shifty, and, not all of them are bad, but, there's a lot of stereotypes that are clearly rooted in anti-Semitism. But the thing is, by the time Lord of the Rings rolled around, by the time he was writing that, I believe I feel like it was World War II had taken place, and Tolkien kind of woke up and snapped out of it, basically, oh shit. And this would not be the first time that, a race in a fantasy series has been painted with anti-Semitic tropes. See the goblins in Harry Potter, who are in charge of money, and somehow that makes them bad. But, reading, the descriptions of the dwarves in The Hobbit, who are, painted sympathetically, but also the failings of dwarves as a whole is that, consistently in fantasy, the thing is, like, oh, the dwarves dug too deep, which strikes me as kind of stupid, because, like, you can dig sideways. Like, you don't have to go to the center of the earth to get valuable things. You can just dig sideways. But whatever, like, they go too deep, they find something they shouldn't, and then bad things happen. So, like, kind of the failings of that, and obviously, the reason the Battle of Five Armies happens is because Thorin can't back down to save his life. Versus, like, Gimli, it is much more humanized. It is, like, a lot more kind of sympathetic and cheerful. And it focuses more on, like, the fantasy elements of it instead of, like, you know, like, it doesn't, I think, do away with what was established in the first, like, Hobbit, but it kind of brings back some of the humanity of, like, oh, Gimli's a dwarf and those are underground, and so we're going to focus on the underground bit instead of, like, the hoary gold bit. So yeah, it is interesting comparing those works, generally. Like, also just because the tone is so totally different in The Hobbit, like, everyone in Lord of the Rings has an impressive fantasy name. That is, like...
Yes.
All of the names that we've said thus far probably sound like gibberish to anyone listening, who doesn't know what's going on. There are 3, I believe, trolls. Is it trolls or ogres? Is there that much of a distinction? Who knows?
I think it's trolls, and I think it's trolls because trolls have the mythology of turning into stone in sunlight. I don't think that there's, like, a thing for ogres.
So anyway, they come across those, and those dudes' names are Bert, Tom, and Bill. Straight up.
Yep.
They're just very normal working class English names. And those are for those boys.
Yep.
And they also, there's an anecdote in, The Hobbit. Let's see. Old Tuke's great-granduncle, Bull Roarer, who was so huge for a hobbit that he could ride a horse, blah blah blah, he charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Greenfields and knocked their king Golfinbull's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole. And in this way, the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same moment. So, Tolkien was like, golf not only exists in this world, it, like, has a specific historical story behind it. So a hobbit invented golf, and that's the only valid explanation for it I will give. Another great thing is that The Hobbit establishes that most of the months and, like, weekdays that we have in our calendar exist in Lord of the Rings. That he just couldn't, and shame on me for not realizing this earlier, but I did find an article about the Lord of the Rings calendar, which apparently the Lord of the Rings is set in March. So this is an article from Polygon by Susanna Polo. And she has a Lord of the Rings Twitter account that tweets kind of, on this day in Lord of the Rings, this thing happened, because Tolkien charted everything, basically, like, on the days that it happens, and, like, the several page-long appendices at the end of each of the books. And it's great, and the thing about that is, they do have, like, a few changes were made, and I didn't realize this. Let me find the part of the article that I want. Yes.
I will just say while you're saying that, the thing about Lord of the Rings is it's this crazy overarching story, and it takes place in less than 13 months because Frodo is legitimately away from home for a year and a month, and that's, like, a thing that's canon. Yeah. Okay, so, from this article, here's one thing you should know about Tolkien timekeeping. In the Shire calendar, every month has 30 days. So what do hobbits do with their 52.4 leap days, you ask? The answer is, as with everything else about hobbits, they throw a party. Hobbits celebrate 2 Yule days at the New Year and 3 Midsummer days, or Lithe days, between the months of Forelife, June, and Afterlife, July. That is, the months of before holiday and after holiday, which is a veritable mood. In leap years, a 4th day is added to Lithe, the absolutely perfectly named holiday of Overlife. So, the freedom from weekday designation makes for the second fantastic innovation of the Hobbit calendar. Every calendar date falls on the same day, same weekday, every year. Bilbo and Frodo's September 22nd birthday is on a Thursday, and it is always on a Thursday. So King
yeah.
behavior.
And I think that's just, like, because when I first realized, like, oh, they're saying things like March in this fantasy world that has, like, different ages and Shire reckonings and all of these things. And It was
and
great.
absolutely should not have, like, things like September or October or
which
November,
are based off
December.
of Latin, which, as far as we know, is not a thing. Well, I guess there's Sylvan, and Sylvane is the Latin word for forest, but yeah, like, there are certain things that are just kind of inescapable when making a fantasy world and working with language.
I think it's also very funny because, like, definitely months that should not exist. I believe January, and then June, July, and April. Even if you're not doing, like, Latin numbering, I think two of those are based off of, like, Latin/Greek gods, and then two of those are based off of, like, Roman figures. So, like, those months should definitely not exist in a world that doesn't have Rome.
Mm-hmm. And yet,
never mind the days of the week, because enough of those are I don't know, do the Norse gods? I guess you could say, like, Norse things exist in this, like, very clearly partially Norse world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, it's very funny whenever, just, like, the things that don't change, or the things that are like, yeah, we're just not gonna bother with that.
Yeah. Because then you contrast this with, like, everything Tolkien did ever in his life. And, like, the amount of work that he put into this, entire series is just so mind-boggling. And something that I've kind of come to realize recently is I have a tendency to kind of be very self-conscious of, like, oh, I feel like I'm doing too much, or I'm, like, you know, over-investing myself in something, or I'm, like, in a very teenagery way of, like, if I care about this thing, I'm not going to be considered cool. Like, very self-conscious of myself when I'm like, oh, maybe I should, like, be more restrained and more reserved. And then kind of preparing for this episode kind of made me realize, like, well, Tolkien did objectively a lot, and that wasn't too much. That is something that draws people to him. That is something that so many people around the world, like, love. And so I think also looking at Tolkien is just an example of, like, wholeheartedly throwing yourself into a project, or wholeheartedly throwing yourself into something that you love, is not a bad thing. And I think it's important to kind of, like, I kind of needed to reframe that for myself as well and come to that realization of, oh, like, I work hard on things that I care about, and I care very strongly about the things that I care about, and neither of those things are bad or too much, and are not necessarily a character flaw. I don't know, it's an important lesson. And there's this bit from the article that I just mentioned, that I actually wanted to pull up. The reason I had to scroll up is because I was on the part that I really liked about it, which is, every year, I watch people cry when Boromir dies, rejoice when Eowyn tears off her helmet, and jeer when Denethor bites the dust. They reply with "Fool of a Took" when Pippin drops the stone in the well, and with "Fly, you fools" when Gandalf falls. When I tweet that Frodo and Sam are leaving the road to travel overland in the final fever dream stretch to Mount Doom, they tweet encouragement, or talk about how their thesis is nearly done, or just say "mood." The theoretical appeal of fantasy stories is how disconnected they are from our everyday experience. But that contrast of the person who never believed they could be a part of something so massive is one of the central themes of Tolkien's Middle-earth tales. There's something deeply appropriate in how the writer's attention to detail allows readers to maintain that connection between the epic's events of his story and the events of their lives. So yeah, attention to detail is good. And Tolkien, while not necessarily the golden standard, definitely I think changed a lot of how we look at stories and language and high fantasy in general. And that is something that I'm very thankful for as a person.
Yeah. I also think Tolkien, kind of, as much as it's like, Tolkien should not be the end-all be-all of how fantasy's written, Tolkien does a couple of really great things that I wanted to highlight just as a writer. Is one thing that he does is he's not afraid he doesn't shy away from having, like, multiple very important things happening simultaneously. Because a lot of fantasy books, inherently only have one, like, main character, whereas I would say, like, maybe not every member, but most of the members of the Fellowship of the Rings are a main character and, like, definitely have an important role. But because they only have one main character, that's, like, they have a very linear plot, which I think is good, but Tolkien proves that you can have a very, like, mixed and having crazy different things happen at different times. And you can have, like, multiple very important battles happening simultaneously, because I believe in the books, Helm's Deep happens at the same time as, like, there's a battle going on at Rivendell separately, or there's, like, the elves are fighting one battle and they're fighting Helm's Deep, and the Treants are also fighting. And so I think Tolkien does a really good job of being like, you can have multiple very important things happening on top of each other, and that doesn't make a bad story. And then also, that gets back into the fact that I think a lot of fantasy writers tend towards having a history that is very linear. Like, this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and this thing happened, but there's not overlap, or like histories don't intersect and overlap. And I think what makes Tolkien really interesting and what is a good thing to take away is that both like our realistic history and the history of his world has a bunch of things that happen simultaneously and happen on top of each other, and that makes for a very rich and interesting world. And so I think like as much as you shouldn't look at Tolkien as the end all be all of writers, it's one of the things to take away from him is it's okay to have a world that is chaotic and crazy and where things happen on top of each other and like aren't all very linear or broken up and separated. Because that's not as true to life as something where a bunch of things happen at the same time.
Yeah, life is messy.
Life is messy.
And stories don't need to reflect that all the time, but I think the stories that do are definitely doing something very brave and important. So yeah, Lord of the Rings is cool.
It is cool.
I'm due for a rewatch. I think this conversation has proved that I am a little too rusty on this, so I think I'm going to need to go rewatch this at some point.
Very good.
So I'll probably start on that today. But yeah. Well,
we've just about hit 2 hours.
Woohoo!
A very long discussion.
Very long
Not
discussion.
even touching on everything about barely touching on a quarter of Lord of the Rings, probably. But yeah. It's been good. It's been a good time.
Yes. We're not going to have outro music this week, but
no.
Stick around to see if we make any next week. So yeah.
I guess it's time for the 3, 2, 1, the outro that we made up on the fly.
Oh yeah.
All right. Okay. Let's try this again.
3,
2, 1.
Bye, nerd.
Bye, nerd.
Damn it.
That was better. All right. I'm ending now.
Hello all, this is Eli here with another Correction Corner. As I was editing, I realized or I recognized a couple of factual errors and mistakes that we made when talking about the series. And so just to make sure that everyone listening gets the most accurate information, I wanted to add this here as a kind of series of footnotes to just go over what is accurate and what information we missaid. One example of this is that I said that there are 4 named female characters in the Lord of the Rings books. That is inaccurate. There are a whole slew of female characters who are hobbits, such as Rosie Cotton, a number of Bilbo's relatives who are named and given place at the beginning of the books. But outside of hobbits, there are only 4 named female characters, and those are, of course, the Lady Arwen, the Lady Galadriel, Shelob, and Eowyn. Another thing that we messed up on is when I said that Isildur, Aragorn's ancestor who cut the ring from Sauron's finger, drowned. That is not correct. He was tricked by the ring to going into a river during a shootout with bows and arrows, where he was then slain by an arrow. So while he did die in water, he did not die of drowning. Another mistake I made is that I said the month of April was based off of a Latin word. That is not correct as far as I know. What I meant is the month of August, which is named after, of course, the Emperor Augustus Caesar. And then finally, it feels pertinent to add in the fact that Aragorn is not in fact a half-elf. He is of the Dunedain, a group of men who, while many thousands of years ago had 2 marriages which introduced elven blood into their lineage, are not considered in Middle-earth to be half-elves or to have all that much elven relation. They are just men blessed with very long lives and are considered to be the noblest of the race of men. All of these corrections are, as I mentioned, very pedantic, very small, but I think it's important for us to strive to be completely accurate. So in the future, if we ever make a mistake that we catch later, we will either do what Caroline did, where we edit the information directly into the podcast, or I will put it here as a sort of series of footnotes to give people the most accurate information possible. Thank you all so much for listening. We look forward to talking to you again next week.